Welcome to our IUME Colloquia series. Thank you so much for being here and spending your evening with us. I'm Barry Goldenberg. I'm a doctoral student here at Teachers College and also one of the research fellows at the Institute for Urban and Minority Education, which we call IUME. So again, it's really exciting to great crowd tonight, great group of folks. So thank you so much for being here. It's a little bit about the Colloquia series. I think one thing we always do with this series and what we've done in the past is really have a space for doctoral students, kind of emerging scholars, to talk about their work in a comfortable setting. I know that isn't always possible, and there aren't a lot of spaces for students and emerging scholars and like Dr. Bristol to talk about their work. In the past, we've had doctoral students go, we've had master's students go, we've had a Fulbright scholar, we've had 2 postdocs. So this series is really for emerging scholars to talk about their work and to have a space, a critical space to talk about their work. That's why I love this roundtable format as well, so we can have a great discussion after. So that's kind of what the IUME Colloquia series always has been, and why it's really important to what we do as an institute and what we continue to do moving forward. So with that being said, I'll introduce Dr. Bristol. Read this impressive bio here. We're so glad he's here. Dr. Travis J. Bristol is a former high school English teacher in New York City Public Schools and teacher educator with the Boston Teacher Residency Program. He is currently a research and policy fellow at the Stanford Center for Opportunity, Policy and Education, SCOPE, where Linda Darling-Hammond serves as faculty director. His research interests focus on the intersection of race and gender in organizations. Specifically, Travis examines how policy levers used by local, state, national, and international actors influence teacher workplace experiences and retention, as well as student learning. Travis's dissertation on black male teachers' pathways into the profession, experiences, and retention was awarded fellowships from the Office of the Provost, Vice President for Diversity and Community Affairs here at Teachers College, the American Educational Research Association, AERA, the Ford Foundation, and the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation. Travis is a product of New York City Public School System. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dr. Bristol, for presenting your work, and we look forward to the evening. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Barry. What I'd like to do first, I am at heart, first I'm a little sick, but at heart I'm a teacher, and I think there is no sort of text without context. It's important for me to get to know who are the other people in the room. And so I'll just ask you to sort of just go around, say who you are, what your affiliation here is with the college, and then we'll begin. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Yolanda Seelig-Ruiz, and I'm an assistant professor in English education here at Teachers College.
My name is Jolene Lane. I'm Director for Diversity and Community Affairs at Teachers College.
Hi, my name is Ashley Maxie Norman. I go by Maxie. I'm currently a master's student here in the Counseling Psychology program.
Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Etienne, and I'm a master's student in the Sociology and Education program.
Aisha Jackson, doctoral candidate in curriculum teaching.
It was more in my first semester of the English education doctoral program, and I work with the community as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia Carvajal. I'm a master's student here, second year sociology and education, also working with.
Hi, I'm Shawneek Robinson. I'm not a student affiliated with Teachers College, but I am a Teach for America alum, and I currently am Associate Director for K-12 at the College Board here in New York City.
My name is Paul Barrett. I am actually a Teach for America board member of the second year. I teach high school history and arts.
Paul, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
My name is Annie. I also Teach for America core member. I taught my school for 6 years, and now I support first and second year teachers with Teach for America in Washington Heights, Oregon.
Hi, Priscilla Forsyth. My sister has actually got a PhD at Teachers College. That's one affiliation I have at Teachers College, but I am here with the Teach for America folk as well. I work on staff here in New York.
My name is Adriana. I'm a first year master's in community health ed.
My name is Moses Lopez. I'm a first year doctoral student in English education.
My name is Nick Somarelos. I am an alum of TC, recent alum, master's in health education, and a former student of Dr. Bristol.
I just think that's awesome.
Yes. It is so awesome.
My name is Naron Willis. I'm a faculty fellow here at IUME.
Go ahead. No, I was going to introduce you. No, I've already introduced myself. You don't hear from me anymore.
I'm Davina Wu. I am here. I'm a graduate of actually Columbia College, but I'm also here as a member of the KIP NYC, which is a charter school network here in New York City.
Hi, I'm Sophia Nodoswala. I also work with Teacher America. I'm on staff in the New York region, and I'm also a master's student in the Adult Learning and Leadership program here at TC.
Hi, I'm Brian Asinja. I'm just a guest, and I'm working on a startup that does African digital content for kids.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ronnie Enriquez. I'm a first-year teacher at a middle school in Crown Heights, and I'm just here to be a scholar and learn what I can.
Hi everyone, my name is Brian. Previously I was teaching at an all-boys charter school in Brooklyn, and now I work on staff at Teach for America.
My name is Ellie. I'm a high school teacher and currently work on staff for Teach for America.
I'm Brian Johnson, former teacher and work for Teach for America.
My name is Fanuel. I'm a third-year teacher at Bristol.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. What you said?
My name is Fanuel.
My name is Brian Clark. I work for New Leaders, formerly New Leaders for Your Schools. I'm just here to learn.
So I want to begin by Ferguson is on my mind. I assume it's on your mind. As a man, as a black man, as a father of a little black boy, these are hard times, and so that's where I'm at. And so I think I owe it to you to let you know that as we move forward. I graduated from TC in May with my PhD. I was in EPSA, so not too far removed. It's very comforting to see many familiar faces. Yolanda, who was on my dissertation committee, and who has been mentor. Jolene, who I've known since I started working as a teacher in New York City with the program. I worked with Jolene. Nixon, who was my student in the 10th grade. And he's a master's, well, he was a master's student. And Duran and Aisha, we took some classes together. I want to spend some time talking about my work, and I sort of situate my work as really being at the intersection of research, practice, and policy. And so that's going to sort of organize the way that I talk about this presentation. And so as it relates to sort of the research, my dissertation was on 27 black male teachers in Boston public schools. And so I'll spend some time talking about what I learned from that research, interviewing 27 black male teachers. And then I'll spend some time talking about the PD that I designed. So I spent some time researching people. And because I had one foot in practice, I was a teacher educator, I began to apply some of my findings in practice. And then I'll spend some time at the end talking about some of my ongoing work around policy, some of the work I'm doing now with this city council in Boston. As you may or may not know, I didn't know this until I went to Boston. Boston is under a federal court order to have 25% of their teachers, they should be black. And so Boston is really grappling with how do they diversify their teaching force. I've been working with the city council and members of the Office of Human Capital to give them some strategies to think about how to diversify the teaching force. So as it relates to black male teachers, there is this sense that having black male teachers can improve the learning outcomes for black boys. This idea is based on having that if black boys who don't necessarily have black fathers, if they have a black male teacher, then they might have a role model, someone that they might be able to look up to. But I think as we think about having more black male teachers, it's first important to get a sense of how many there are. And so for that, we'll turn to Secretary Arnie Duncan for that number.
It's a pleasure to be here today to do something which I think we do too little of in the field of education, and that is to celebrate success. As many of you know, Historically black colleges and universities, including Xavier, were established a century ago for the purpose of training a generation of black teachers. Nationwide, 35% of public school students are black or Hispanic, but less than 15% of our teachers are black or Latino. It is especially troubling that less than 2% of our nation's teachers are African American males. Why would you want to?
So the numbers, so Secretary Duncan tells us, or suggests that less than 2%, actually the number is 1.9% of all teachers in U.S. public schools are black men. Approximately 2% are Latino. And oftentimes missing from this conversation is are sort of the experiences of Asian teachers, particularly Southeast Asian teachers. Where I'm at Stanford, there are particular communities where Southeast Asian boys have some of the same learning outcomes as black boys. And so there is this idea that if we want to have more, or that having more can increase the learning outcomes for black boys. And so we are sort of faced with this reality that in U.S. public schools, that a large, that we see this sort of disproportion of white teachers relative to white students. Most of the teaching force remains white. And so if policymakers believe that having more black male teachers or more Latino male teachers, for example, can increase learning outcomes for black and Latino males, right? We are left with this reality that that our nation, most of the students, most of the teachers in our public schools are white. Oftentimes when I talk about this idea of having more black male teachers, I'm often, one of the questions that I get are, that I receive, well, why does it matter, right? Why do we need, why do black boys, for example, need black male teachers? Or Latino boys need Latino male teachers? Shouldn't the quality of the teacher matter rather than the teacher's race? And so I'll turn that question over to you. A couple of months ago, I was on the Boston NPR station, and the host asked a black male teacher and myself, who were on the program, he said, are we in a situation, right, where we need black teachers teaching black kids and white teachers teaching white kids? And so with the person sitting next to you, I'll ask you to sort of turn and talk. I'll give each person about 30 seconds to sort of share their response, and then we'll come back and have a short discussion. And this is the question: are we in a situation where we need black teachers teaching black kids and white teachers teaching white kids? Okay, 30 seconds each person, and then we'll come back.
I think so. Not entirely making up the whole part of that really one of the things he taught us is to be aware. Awareness about what's going on around us. Understanding the world around us. And I guess, I don't know if black people can do that, but in my experience that
There are lots of responses to that. One of the things that will be a opportunity for all of us what strikes me about that challenge in front of the classroom for such but that's what I think is most significant. I think that's what you're worried about. Whether or not I'm never young at all. The real folks who really need this are white students. They're stereotypes. in a way that makes them
And I think
So now is a good time for the other person to share, if they haven't shared it yet.
as a student, really? So, you know, I was right. I wouldn't have needed to say.
So the student
Right, okay. Right.
All right. All right. So what did people say? Are we in a situation more than 3/4 of the teaching force in U.S. public schools are white? This year was the first time where students of color made up the majority of students. Are we in a situation, given this persistent opportunity gap, are we in a situation where we need black teachers teaching black kids and white teachers teaching white kids? Thoughts? Yes.
I strongly believe that is something that we do need as as a minority person myself. I was just sharing with this group that just seeing you standing up there with your PhD and educating us about this touchy topic, this topic that I think for me I have a lot of interest in. Just that alone for me speaks about what I'm doing and what we need in the classroom, which I don't see a lot of minority people teaching students of color. And in my school, I'm the only one right now, and I'm new, and it's a new school, and it's a high poverty school, and I think that just my presence alone inspires a lot of the students there to want to do good, to want to be somebody and do something with their lives. So that's why I believe that we need more teachers of color.
Okay, so according to Ronnie says right that we need that having more black teachers in this example can serve as an inspiration.
Correct.
Okay, other people. Brian.
So I'm actually not an educator, so I may have a different perspective. But I was actually of the view that the way it's phrased, it seems so contrast. If it was rephrased as needing more Black or African American teachers, I would agree with that. But the way it's phrased right now, my absolute answer would be no, because there's so many other ways of learning, not just in the classroom. You can learn through sports, you can learn through reading, you can learn through social experiences. So there could be other ways that we still find time to mentor and inspire.
Okay. So there is this idea that there might be other ways, and in the back, Rosanny talked about class, right, Rosanny? So do you want to maybe talk a little about that?
Yeah, I wonder, even though I grew up in the neighborhood where I taught, and I did come from a lower income background, now being a teacher, a Latino teacher, or like a black teacher from the black students, and maybe you're of a middle class or high class, does that mean that you can relate, with the students now that you have like a higher income? Does income and class play a role in how well you can connect and inspire students? Does that, affect it or not? And I also thought about a white teacher that may have an experience of a lower income background that can share that experience with, a student, Latino or black student that comes from a lower income background.
So classes are missing. Yes.
Me and Brendan actually looked at it a bit differently, on which we felt as though this question was a little constraining in that we need black teachers in all classes, not just in black students. Because the perspective of Black America needs to be with all student population. So we felt as though please add on if you need to. We felt as though that not only for black kids, but also for all kids to experience what is it to have a black person and their experience of also socioeconomic status. What is it then for black males to be present in all these classes? And also, like looking into that data, that you said 3.9 are black and brown and male teachers in America. That number is also deceiving a bit because they're highly concentrated in urban America. So a lot of the white, non-urban kids don't get to experience a black male teacher. And both of us have never had in our K-12 education a black male teacher until high school years. So we don't get to see them until you advance to a higher level of education.
Final comment, Duran?
And just for the sake of being controversial, I wholeheartedly agree, but wonder whether or not it is helpful for us to think about white students actually having black teachers. And in the context of Ferguson, it makes me think about whether or not the outcome would have been different had Officer Winslow had a black teacher in his life at any particular point to unseat some of the stereotypes he may, or I believe he had, about black men in society.
And I said yes and no. Of course, absolutely, for all of the reasons we talked about, role models and so forth, but I think it also has to be the right black teacher. And what I mean by that is oftentimes, and I can only speak as an African American, that we're in front of our students and we think we know them in certain ways, and then we treat them sometimes in ways that can be traumatic and damaging to them. So it has to be a black teacher of a particular consciousness, of a particular understanding, of a particular empathetic, and certainly love has to be driven by that, and not just being black, right? Because sometimes you can do more damage. And the same thing with white and Latinos. And so for me, it has to be the right teacher. The mind and the heart have to be right.
So when we look at the right teacher as it relates to students of color, we now, because of our ability to sort of use quantitative analysis to look at large-scale data, we have found that there have been some value added for students of color when they have teachers of color. So I'll just share 3 studies. So Thomas D. looks at the Tennessee class size study. Tennessee class size study? Anyone? Tennessee class size study? Yeah, you want to?
Well, I remember I was looking at I was in a data class here, and I'm a history education student, so it was a struggle when I was working with it, but it was awesome trying to analyze whether kindergartners specifically benefit by having whether black kindergartners and Latino kindergartners benefit by having either a black or Latino student and teacher, and I came across Dee's work and trying to decipher that, but it's powerful.
Yeah. So the Tennessee class size, so what the state of Tennessee did was they tried to understand how might having a small class size, how might having a small class size influence learning outcomes. So they randomly assigned students to having a smaller class or a bigger class. And this is where lots of the sort of small school movement came from. It came from this sort of Tennessee class size study that found like a very small effect for learning in a small classroom. But Thomas D. looks at this Tennessee class size study, and he found that when students had a same race teacher, they performed better, right? So this is right. So the randomized controlled trial is considered the gold standard of empirical research. And so he found that when same race students had a same race teacher, that they performed better academically. Yes.
Is that for all races or specifically for students of color?
So he looked at black and white students. Yeah. The early childhood longitudinal study, which is it's a study. Does anyone know ECLSK? Yeah, ECLSK. Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about the study?
Sure. So, forgive me, I don't remember the years that the study looked at, but basically it's one of the largest data sets on students in kindergarten, looking at a range of different factors like family characteristics, to different diagnoses and problems. So like family relationships with the school is just a wide range of different things you can look at in terms of like kindergartners in the U.S.
Yeah. So this is considered a nationally representative data set, and so the data here are what we believe to be sort of nationally representative of all students, right, in the United States and teachers. And what Ozad found was that same-race teachers, the students were more likely to give their students higher scores. So black teachers were more likely to give their black students higher scores, and white teachers were more likely to give their white students higher scores. And then this last piece, this is at the college level, which is really interesting. This came out in sort of the gold standard in economic journals. And these researchers found that when looking at a community college, they found that when a student of color had a same race, when a student of color had a professor of color, they were more likely to graduate, they were more likely to complete their courses, and they were less likely to drop out. So we do have some quantitative data that begin to suggest that there is value added, if you will, for students of color when they have a teacher of color. Secretary Arne Duncan in 2012 goes to Morehouse and he launches this black male teacher recruitment campaign, calling black men to the blackboard. In 2013, Richard Ingersoll, who is at UPenn, looked at SAS, the School and Staffing Survey, which is another nationally representative survey of teachers. And Richard Ingersoll found that minority male teachers, predominantly black male teachers, were more likely to leave, right? They had the highest rates of turnover. And so if there is this idea that clearly that there is a value added for having black male teachers, we clearly need to recruit them. And then you have this other study that says, well, they're more likely to leave. I entered the conversation as a researcher trying to maybe consider, should we shift the conversation from recruitment to retention? And so the study that I designed focused, or tried to understand black male teacher recruitment and specifically retention. So these were my dissertation had 4 research questions, but for this I'll just share 2. And these were my questions. I wanted to understand the school-based experiences of black male teachers. So how did black male teachers experience schools? And I also wanted to understand the organizational context. So my different schools my black male teachers experience different types of schools differently, right? And what did that mean for their decisions to sort of stay or leave? The year before I designed my dissertation, as I was living in Cambridge, and Ron Ferguson, who runs the Achievement Gap at Harvard, he helped me design a survey that I administered to all black male teachers in Boston public schools. And what I found after administering that survey was that the number of black men in the building seemed to influence their responses. So if you were the only black man in your building, you felt and you experienced your school very differently than if you were a black man in a school with many other black male teachers. And so, my qualitative study, I had 27 black male teachers in 14 schools, 7 schools with 1 black male teacher, 7 schools with many more. And I was trying to understand, right, how did the number of black men in the building influence their experiences and their decisions to sort of stay or leave. Questions before I move on? Okay, so I'll share some of the findings and then I'll go to talk about what I did with the findings. So like I said, I interviewed 27 black male teachers. I interviewed them twice, I observed them. And so I'm not necessarily, I won't, if at the end I can talk about the difference between what I call loners and groupers. But right now I'm talking about their experiences in the aggregate, right? So the sum total of everyone's experience. Dennis Sanchez, he's an 8th grade teacher. And many of the black men talked about feeling or perceiving or believing that their colleagues saw them as being intellectually inferior. Dennis Sangister said, I mean, it makes you feel inadequate. So he's talking about sitting at a grade team meeting. He says, it makes me feel inadequate. Am I saying something that's crazy? I've been educated, I have a master's. I've passed the teacher certification test, the MTEL, just like everyone else. And it's frustrating, you know. He's talking about people not necessarily listening to him, not valuing or validating his voice. And so what I began to realize was that there were some particular socio-emotional challenges, some trauma, if you will, about being a black male teacher in schools. So this idea that one finding was about sort of socio-emotional challenges. And then the other thing that I found was that many of the black male teachers talked about their colleagues seeing them as being a behavior manager than a teacher, right? A police officer than a teacher. So Jermaine Carter says, you know, I can see most people would feel enthused that they're helping out their colleagues, like they pick me because they respect me, but it's also becoming a burden now because I have to do other things. I have other things to do. I have to plan. I have to plan for my kids to be on a specific scope and sequence, specific track, to plan my scope and sequence, and correct papers. Just the regular things that teachers do. And so there was this sense that on one hand, right, there were these sort of socio-emotional challenges around being a black male teacher, and also that being in schools, that their practice wasn't valued, right? That they were trained to become teachers, but here they find themselves being encapsulated in these very stereotypical roles that made it challenging for them to navigate through these spaces. And so one of the recommendations from my dissertation was to for practitioners, was to design this professional development program for black male teachers and by extension teachers of color. Tony Bright, who runs the Carnegie Foundation, who was formerly at the University of Chicago, he talks about this idea that we improve organizations when we grow both the people and the organization. I can talk about my policy recommendations about the organization, but we also have to think about how we grow the people. And so this recommendation about helping and supporting black male teachers and male teachers of color was really about the people recommendation. So the PD that I designed was to address the unique needs, the unique experiences of black male teachers. And so while I was conducting my dissertation, I had a family, so we had to eat, so I had a very full-time job. And my full-time job was I was a teacher educator with the Boston Teacher Residency Program, which is 12-month, I think there's a program here. My sister who walked in was in TC's residency program, right? So it's a 12-month program, and so because I was in classrooms and working with teachers, I was in a space to actually put into place some of these findings. And so the mission of the program was to provide socio-emotional support to male teachers of color and a space to reflect on practice, because the idea was it wasn't a fraternity. The thing that brought us together was that we were teachers, and that we needed to, in order to become better teachers, we can talk about our problems, but we also need to think about solutions to improve our practice. So the meetings took place every Friday from 5 to 7, right? People say people don't come to PDs, right? People will come to PDs, and you'll see video that there were actually people coming to these PDs. The first half of the meeting focused on this idea of socio-emotional support, and the second half focused on this idea of helping people provide solutions to their dilemmas of practice, what one little calls a professional learning community. So I'll ask you, before I go in and talk a little bit about the PD, just to sort of think about what are the benefits and the drawbacks of providing PD to teachers based on their social location, race and gender, for example. What are the drawbacks of providing PD, designing PD for teachers based on their social location? So again, with the person sitting next to you, please ensure that someone sitting next to you has a partner. 30 seconds each person. What are the benefits and the drawbacks of designing a PD for teachers based on their social location? Okay? And there's some seats up here, folks.
So that can be first
I'm wondering about folks who may have that. I imagine if you have some black they also say have another role. I think it was more focused on thinking about which one do we go to because yes, I belong to. So that's what I think perception. But also might not identify as the dominant experience that you do. So say 26 say you have one that is I have a personal experience where there is no more space to talk about their challenges. But those should limit us from providing for that kind of situation. That all the differences work for us. And it's about what do you
I'm curious about what people said. What are the potential drawbacks and benefits of design PD to teachers based on their social location, race, and gender? Yes.
I was just going to say, I feel like an assumption of the question is that that general or normal, whatever PD, if you're going to use that language, is not informed by social location, and I would wholeheartedly disagree with that statement. I think being intentional about who you are creating your professional development just seems sensible. I think a lot of the things that we do as educators, like in the classroom, when I design my curriculum, plan my lessons, I have to think about who my students are. And I think that is something that gets lost when we bring it to an all-adult circle, and we forget that we have to do those same things about like examining what values are behind the instruction or the professional development that we're creating. So I just think it's responsible. We talked about drawbacks, but I'll just stop at those benefits that just as I believe my students are benefited by me considering where they are located, race, genders, socioeconomic status, I think the same thing applies to us when we talk about professional development.
Okay. So, Aisha, you guys were talking about some potential drawbacks.
Yes, we shared several, kind of going from talking about the ways in which a homogenized group can share a lot of the same ideas, whether it's a bitch and moan session, or whether it's just not having some outside opinion challenging your thinking. We also talked about if the person who's designing this professional development feels like they're from a similar social location, they might miss some perspectives. If I was designing something for Black women teachers, I would be thinking about my own experiences as if there is a black female experience of teaching and not necessarily incorporate all of the different nuances that might go into that particular kind of social location.
I would say the only other thing is also it presupposes that if I'm of a certain race or gender, that I'm also going through the same issues that another person with social location is going through as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
The art of listening as well can actually, like, sometimes, well, I'm not an educator, but like, sometimes teachers can get caught up in their schedule of, like, getting out the material without actually taking the time to get to know the students. So that can put a teacher in a very difficult situation because the teacher doesn't really know the students they're teaching. So if you don't know the diagnosis of whatever disease, or, like, let's say, I'm using it in my training, like, in the health field, like, if you don't know the diagnostic of a certain disease, then you won't be able to know how to treat it.
Yes. And so PD, that sort of responsive, it's coming to your point at the back, that oftentimes PD for the work that we do with teachers is somehow lost because it's sort of very, like, it's not like the work that we do with students, right, where we're very intentional, right? And I think Nixon's point is about that if we're going to do work with adults, we need to sort of really understand their needs and be responsive to them. So I'll just quickly share some of this. So in 2013, like I said, the meetings were split up into sort of two different, two parts. The first part focused on sort of like socio-emotional support. And then the second part focused on a dilemma of practice. I'm going to zero in on the month of February, where, so you see that on the month of February, teachers, they were asking, what is the role of male teachers of color in educating boys of color? And one of the things that I thought was particularly striking, I should say that what happened at the end of each meeting, I would ask participants, well, what would they want to do for the next meeting? And so when this question came up about what's the role of teachers of color, male teachers of color in educating boys of color, I was particularly taken aback. And I think that there is this sort of underlying assumption that just because you are, we talked about this earlier, right? Just because you are a male of color, a male teacher of color, that you automatically know what to do with boys of color. And what I found was that many of the participants in the program said, well, everyone thinks I'm supposed to, right, magically know what to do with these boys, but no one taught me. I mean, I went to a teacherette program, really good, very reputable teacherette program, but no one taught me what to do with all the boys that the school began to sort of magically put into my class, right? And so in this safe space, these male educators of color were able to sort of ask this question and then to get some feedback on what to do. Matt, what's swag?
It's like, what you asking what the term
Yeah,
means?
what does it mean? Yeah.
It's like style, I think, like, like something that's cool, hip,
yes.
Something that's in.
Yes. I did a similar presentation when I was at Stanford, and it took me a while to pull that answer up, but I'm in New York, so it's that's less a challenge. But yeah, so this idea of sort of math swag, right? So sort of be cool, right? And so here you'll hear this teacher talk about how he understands his role in working with boys of color and what he does with this idea of swag. This person you might recognize because he's a doctoral student here.
Align with sort of my version of cool, which is academically cool, is we have something, especially in my classroom, called math swag. So it's like, swag is actually an acronym standing for students who achieve great gains. So we talk about what math swag means and how it means like mathematical confidence. But in students' context, it's something different.
So this is Greg. Greg, I think Greg's now a second year student. Does anyone second or third year student in the math ed program, doctoral student. And he was one of the co-facilitators in Boston. So what's Greg's, I'll play it one more time, but how do you think Greg is sort of sharing with these other participants here about what he is doing to, how he sees his role as being a male educator of color and working with, in terms with the boys of color?
Align with sort of my version of cool, which is academically cool, is we have something, especially in my classroom, called math swag. So it's like, you know, swag is actually an acronym standing for students who achieve great gains. So we talk about what math swag means and how it means like mathematical confidence. But you know, in students' context, it's something different.
So what's Greg saying here? What's Greg doing with this idea of math swag? How is he appropriating this term? I see one hand, I see two hands. I'm a teacher, so I'm waiting to give people some wait time. What's Greg doing? Yes, sir.
He's using the language that the students are familiar with in order to draw a connection to another idea that he's trying to get them to understand.
Other responses, yeah? And then we'll go back.
The first thing that came to my mind was, and so I think that's very important, I think he's being like culturally responsive to the students. He understands the culture, and therefore he's trying to respond to their culture with this angle of, you know, academics now that has swag. So that's what I think.
Yeah?
Yeah, I was gonna say pretty much the same thing. He's trying to help the students to gain confidence in math and their math skills. So like everyone said, he's applying their own language to what he needs them to do and to help them advance as students, which I think is really important.
Yeah. Yes?
I wonder if he did some work gathering information about the students' prior experiences with math. You know, if they had math anxiety, or if they, you know, had some success or no success with mathematics in the past, and the teachers that they had in the past in that subject area. And I wonder if he gathered information on that in order to create, you know, to create this, to build connections with the students, to build their confidence in math.
So my hunch is Greg was teaching at English High School, which is you know, one of the most troubled schools in Boston. And so, you know, those students, in my sense, you know, were probably, you know, historically had lots of issues. But I'm not necessarily sure if he did that. But I think that what we do here is that he's sort of valuing, not devaluing, right? The context and the language that the students are using, and sort of finding and creating a bridge for that in his classroom. And you talk about, and people talk about this idea of valuing the pool, that the role of, they saw their role as being a male educator of color is to value what students brought into the class. We'll listen to an English example. Sick with it. What does that mean?
Not cool.
She said not cool?
It's the opposite. It's like, sick with it is like, you know, you're really good at something. Like you really got a skill.
Okay. So yeah, so to be sort of highly skilled, right? So we'll hear how this English teacher talks about how he uses this term in his class. And as you listen, you might, my sense was that when participants, if they tried to share these ideas in a faculty meeting or in a grade team meeting, that they more than likely would have been shunned. And so in this space, right, they're hearing that, oh, so you do that, oh, I do that. And so it's okay, despite what I might be experiencing. So here goes another teacher building off of Greg.
Ideas for evidence. So one of the things that, you know, I hear kids say often is, you know, like, oh, he's sick with it. So what I did was I took the Common Core, you know, supporting ideas with evidence and changed it to supporting ideas with quotes. So when kids are in class and they, you know, saying some opinionated stuff, I'm like, nah, you're not sick with it yet. I'm like, you're not ready, you know? I need you to get sick with it. And, you know, I sit in front of my classroom and I want the kids to go back to the text and then they find it in there, and, you know? So it's like you were saying, you gotta listen to what they're saying and be creative. I think that's the hardest part is being creative enough to mesh the two.
Okay. Thoughts? Comments? Yes.
Sure. I mean, I'm not a teacher, so, well, at least not in a formal sense. I think of myself as a teacher in terms of spirit. But some of this seems like common sense, right? Like, why wouldn't you adapt to your students if you want to teach them, if you want to, you know, focus on informing them rather than forming them through some sort of behavioral construct? If we think about like our role as educators as people who are supposed to sort of just make sure they walk straight lines and sort of dot every I and cross every T, then maybe this is not common sense. But it seems to me that it would make sense to figure out and listen to them first in order to educate them, right? Because education really needs to draw out. So if we think of them as having value to begin with, then as opposed to like just empty vessels that we have to pour into, then maybe some of this adaptation would happen more often.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a myth that we have to completely change ourselves in order to identify with our students. I think that there's an exchange going on all the time. So, you know, the way that I speak, you know, so I'll use this example. I worked at an opportunity program at Marymount Manhattan College for 8 years. And during that time, I had been a doctoral student the whole time. And once I became a dissertator, right, when my students ask me what do I do at school, I say dissertate, right? And they started adopting that language. One day I'm gonna dissertate too. But when I tell them, when they ask me, so Blanca, are you writing? And I say, no, I'm actually on Twitter. And they say, oh, that's slow for your life. You know what I mean? So there's an exchange going on. It's never just I'm going to adapt to my students. There's an exchange of knowledge going on, right? That I think it's false to say that we have to completely change ourselves in order to identify with our students, because they want to see you too. They want you to be full and whole and you know, and yourself. Because if you're trying to be too much like them, they can see that right away. They're not trying to buy that. They run away from folks like that. You know, but if you talk about who you are and then you know, you don't make fun of them because they say, oh, that's slow for your life, Blanca. You know, like, and then I'm like, what's slow for your life? What did I do wrong? You know, like, it's a way of, it's a knowledge exchange.
Okay. We'll just go around, yeah.
Just 2 points. I would say I agree with what you're saying. I think the assumption there is that that their lives, their language, their culture is valued by all involved. And I think specifically within, like, I teach global history, so my students are reading primary, secondary sources, they're writing essays, they're doing all of these things. And language is involved at like every stage, whether verbal or written. And so a lot of times in describing, we taught Julius Caesar a couple weeks ago and taught his death. And one of my students said, Brutus is an op. Like, and is an op. Basically, like, he was like against it. Using their language, and rather than saying, use a different word in the context of a discussion, I'm fine with that. If you can push your conversation, but that has, like, under that is like a value of their language, of their ability to express themselves through that. However, I do agree that, like, you have to teach them the idea of, like, code switch and teaching writing and speech as a convention, and that's also, like, inherently believing that there's value in their language as opposed to just, like, you're going to erase their the way they speak, the way they write in different settings. So at the bottom of it, I think that there has to be, like, a valuing of what they bring to the table, but also a belief in the necessity that they're going to walk into a world that's structured not for them, and they have to learn how to navigate that. And so, there's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's a scaffold. Students aren't going on the MCAS, the equivalent of the New York State Regents, and they're not writing sick with it on the Regents, right? But it's a scaffold to help them understand how to analyze quotes, right? And that's all they're doing. But built into that scaffold is this idea or belief that students have a home language, or and that it can be an academic sort of lens can be sort of applied to them. I thought some other response. Yes.
I just want to add on to the math swag, which I don't know if it's true, if it's correct. I liked how he celebrated the growth. So it's not necessarily a benchmark that is equivalent to everyone else. So he's saying you have math swag as long as you've shown the growth.
Yeah.
So you set a goal for individual kid, and as long as you are achieving to that, you are the math. You have math swag. So every one of us could start on a different point, and he's telling them you will have it as long as you're showing growth. And I appreciate that because we're told data, and half of the time we struggle to understand it, let alone have the students understand what it means to them. Even math class, like give them all kind of information, but what does that mean? But to give them language that's accessible to them and to have them interpret what growth looks like, I appreciate that. I wish I could do that with that sick with it, but I'm still thinking.
It's not that students are proficient or not proficient, right? It's looking at that you have achieved these great gains, right? It's looking at learning over time. Marcel, last
I was going to just respond to something that you said, where you said one would think that it's common sense. And I think that for so many of us as practitioners in the classroom, it is common sense. But some of the challenges around the academic setting of school sometimes bars the teachers from being able to be that in their classes, because they think of things like speaking proper English or standardized English and what that means, or when they tell kids not to bring their ways into the classroom, you know, like what kind of blocking we do when we speak to our kids in that. And so often, and I do a lot of professional development in schools in New York City, and so often I see when teachers are really challenged by the administrations of their schools to act in certain ways that are so different from who they are, what their pedagogy is, what their personal educational philosophy is, so that they have to fit within this framework. And so sometimes it's really hard to balance, you know, really who I want to be, because I want to be sick with it too, you know, like with the kids. But then sometimes my administrator or my AP was walking the rounds, doing the, you know, checking my boards outside my class, and then there's so many other pressures that we have to focus on that we lose sight of the fact of why we're really in those schools and why we're really with those kids.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a great point. That the missing from this is you know, that they're operating in sort of institutional structure, right, where they have to like follow a particular script, if you will. But you know, I think your point's a good one. I mean, I think that it might appear that it is common sense, but I think that many of these teachers struggled to help their colleagues see that what they were doing wasn't magical, right? And the reason why they were having success with their students wasn't because of the color of their skin, right? It was because they were valuing students. So the second part of the meeting, like I talked about, a practitioner, a teacher, got up and he talked about a dilemma in his practice. And so here you have Barak. He's talking about some of his, some of the challenges that he's having around engaging boys in his classroom. So this video is kind of low. It might be hard to hear, but this person right here is speaking, Brett, who was a student teacher of mine.
In the video was, I think, the boy Francisco and Georgie. It seemed like they were conversing about the answers that you were asking for. And I saw that they were like engaged in the content, going over the sheets and then looking back to your instruction. So, that's not a challenge to take, but I think you could possibly look into something in the class where maybe the boys converse more.
It might have been hard to, were you able to make out any of that? Yes, no? Some of it. So Brett is telling Barak, so Brett's a pre-service teacher at this point, and Barak was in his third year teaching elementary school. So he showed some video. His dilemma in his practice was, how do I get boys to engage? And what Brett says is essentially that you should think about doing a think, pair, share, right? If you give students time to sort of think about their response, share their response with the person sitting next to them, and then share it with the class, right? Then that might sort of increase engagement. And so this is the kind of work that happened during the sessions where our teachers talked about or shared their dilemma of practice and got feedback from someone else. What's this video?
I think that was mathematically correct.
Okay, so here you have Greg giving Barak some additional feedback.
right though.
Yeah.
And then it was like, it wasn't the answer that you were looking for.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, because she said, oh, it reminded me of a square. It's one of the signs of a
Square or
square.
an L shape?
Yeah.
Yes.
And she didn't say like, it's an L. And it was like she was so enthusiastic to say it. And it's like, not that you squashed her, but it was like, oh, it's not the
No, I get what you're saying. I remember that I was hoping that she would say something that's more simplified for the class, but I think, I don't know, I forgot what I did, whether I acknowledged it or I just didn't add comment to it.
Yeah, so, I mean, I know, I wouldn't know how to do it from an elementary standpoint, but in a high school standpoint, it's just like, how do you roll with the answer to get it to where you want it to be, rather than just like, alright.
Yeah,
so I don't know what to even call it, but like, you know, if she is like that higher skilled in thinking already, having her elaborate on that more, like what's a different way to say that?
Yeah, totally. Say more about that. What do you
no, but I mean, that's what it's kind of said. You being a math teacher, like she's right.
No.
Quickly, what would you gather from that video? What advice is Greg giving to Barack? Yeah.
Encouraging learning rather than being judgmental.
Yeah. Yes. Right. So instead of saying to the student that the answer is wrong or right, how do you sort of follow the student's sort of train of thought to get them at, to sort of guide them to the answer that they should come up with. And so, I mean, all of this, so, the second half of the meeting, like I said, was focused on this idea of a practitioner getting in front of a group of his peers. These teachers were all at different schools, I should say. They were not in the same school. Clearly, you hear Greg talking about being a high school teacher, and Barack, was an elementary school teacher. So they were all, different teachers, but they were all like some affiliation with BTR, the program where I worked. And each of the meetings each month, it was held in the teacher's classroom. So this is Barack's classroom where we held this meeting. I'll quickly move through this. So the March meeting, people, they wanted help around how do we sort of navigate the various roles that we were asked to play by dint of being a male educator of color. And so one of the things that we walked away with this meeting from was giving participants a script. So many of the men talked about feeling like they were a dean of discipline. I talked about that, and I found it in my study, and it was interesting to find that again, because many of these men were not part of my study. But they talked about feeling like they were a dean of discipline, and they talked about feeling, really obligated to fulfill this role. And so one script, or one strategy that they used, that we came up with collectively as a group, was to, so if the teacher next door to you is saying to you, like, can you watch this boy who is misbehaving, right, during your lunchtime, right, begin to keep a paper trail of that as a way to sort of document, right, the amount of time that this is being asked of you, and that might be an opportunity at some point to maybe push back, but having a paper trail might be helpful. Responsible, always putting out fires. People only call you when the house is burning, right? But not bringing you into the meeting when, the chancellor or whomever is coming. And so one of the things that people talked about was, instead of asking me to try to put out the fire, right, asking their colleague to, let's go to the headmaster, or in Boston, the principal. Let's go to the principal to see, maybe the principal might help us, might give us some suggestions on how to solve this problem. And people talk about this idea of clearly being a translator, right? Some were literally a translator because they were Latino or Asian. I felt like people always called on them to, and clearly called on them to sort of be a sort of a go-between. And while people sort of felt it was important to serve in these roles, they also recognized that these also created a large burden for them. It took away from the opportunity to sort of do work, to help their own students. The March meeting, I won't necessarily play this video, but in the March meeting, Chris Somerville, we're in his class, and he's talking about how he has designed his history course to become an African-American history course. And we talked about this idea of how do you make your curriculum culturally relevant. Again, there's this assumption that just because you're a person of color that you magically know how to make your curriculum culturally relevant. And so in this very safe space, they could say, well, you know, I really don't know how to make my curriculum culturally relevant. There were things that, you know, I can. And so it was helpful for them to have Chris Summerhill, who was a history teacher, talk about how he went about redesigning his history curriculum to be an African American history course. I'll quickly end by showing you a quick clip. At the end of the year, the folks were saying, the guys were saying that, you know, this is well and good that we're doing this work for ourselves, but the reason why we came into the profession was because we wanted to help males of color. And so one of the things that we did was that we held we created a workshop where the participants each took like 5 different topics, and they invited students from one high school to come. And the idea was to have this serve as a recruitment pipeline for male so that these high school students can be exposed to the teaching profession. I'll quickly show this video and tell one quick sort of anecdote from this.
They know the most about, right? A lot of people, their parents know.
So this is the opening session.
This is the opportunity for you guys to be exposed to something that you probably don't really know too much about. You think you know things about it, but most of these workshops basically debunk a lot of stereotypes about being a teacher working in education. Because the reality of it is probably different from what you heard. So definitely ask questions. Right? And so we have our groups. So it's this room, the next room, the room after.
So basically just the right side of the 5th floor one.
So there were several different stations, so they split up into groups. One workshop was about the financial benefits of becoming a teacher. And so in this session, right, we asked students, how much do you think a teacher makes? And so one student said he thought it was like $25,000 a year. Because, you know, we're often told that teachers don't make money, right? And so those of you who are in education, you know, like I am, education in this country is a very lucrative business. And oftentimes it's people are making money off of people who, but education is a very lucrative business. And so, you know, having someone at the district office, a male of color at the district office, talk about how he makes 6 figures, right, was a real paradigm shift. And not that people get into education because they can make a lot of money, but if you're told, but if you realize that like the starting salary in Boston for teachers like 50,000 plus, you're making more money than everyone in your house. And so getting a sense of that, you know, one could actually live on this salary can create a sort of a paradigm shift. Another one was about how do you become a teacher. And so the gentlemen each took these sort of 5 stations, and students rotated. Again, this happened at English High School, where Greg was a teacher. It was like a Friday afternoon, like 90 degrees, and we had 25 guys come, 25 high school students come, because, you know, they really liked their male teachers, and so they showed up. In March 2014, Boston Public Schools took this PD that I designed, and they incorporated it into their district-wide initiative. So they launched the Male Educators of Color Coaching Seminar. This is John McDonough, who is the interim superintendent in Boston. And so now this it's really shifted how the district is thinking about preparing teachers or supporting particularly male educators of color. And so some of the work that the Office of Human Capital, who's sort of running this initiative, they recently told me that they're also going to launch a similar program for principals of color, because they recognize that maybe principals have some of the same challenges, principals of color, and need some of the same supports. Recently, I testified in front of the Boston City Council. Tito Jackson, I mentioned to you at the beginning that Boston is under the sort of federal court order to have 25% black teachers. And so one of the things I've been trying to do with the district, and people were saying this when we talked about having a black teacher, do black kids need black teachers, is really to shift the conversation, to move away from having quotas and really help the district recognize the benefits of diversity, right? And that organizations can achieve their outcomes when they have many different people around the table to problem solve. And so we need to get out of this mindset of we need to have 25% because this is what, you know, Arthur Garrity said in the 70s, and to really think about we need to have a diverse workforce because in this flat or interconnected world, our children need to have a diverse teaching population. And so that's some of the work that I've been doing with the district and the city council. So I'll just end by thanking some of the people who supported this funding, the National Academy of Education, the Alumnus Institute, also the provost and Janet and Jolene who are here from the Office of Diversity and Community Affairs. So thank you, and I'll take questions if you have. Yes.
I'm just thinking,
get some water.
As far as like the male gender, like I know sometimes, like for me personally, like I may not want to go and talk about certain things. How receptive were the people, as far as the males in this program, that actually went and shared some of the, I'm thinking more of the social emotional piece, because I don't know if I saw anything about the social emotional piece really, but like I can see how some people would be hesitant to be like, what, this is like the lady was saying about, this is just to go vent, and I don't want to vent, or I don't want to show that weakness or something like that. Like, I don't know. I'm trying to get to the like, as a male, we don't really talk about our problems, and it's something that has to develop, and it comes with some trust at first. So, how are you able to get all those males to trust each other, come in and talk about it, and I guess. Was it a challenge? How much of a challenge was that?
So I think one benefit of this was that the men who participated were part of the Boston Teacher Residency Program. So they were already a part of an organization that, that had sort of cohort-like feel. So many of them kind of knew, they knew each other because they'd gone through the program. So I don't necessarily know if, so I think that made the trust issue less of a challenge. But I think to your larger question, I mean people people talked about feeling like so at this meeting, right, they talked about some of the roles that they feel like they have to sort of navigate. I mean, I think that it was indeed the case that they felt open to talk about that. How that happened. My gut says I did not go in with the answer. So it was this very, at the end of every meeting, I asked people what they wanted to do, rather than coming in and saying, well, this is what we're going to do today, guys. I mean, that's a horrible way to teach. I think it's a horrible way to work with adults. So I think that if people value and recognize that you see them as learners, then that begins to change the dynamic. That was my sense. Leslie, and then.
So the data that you have on that chart, did the participants feel, did their feelings increase based on the sort of numbers of black male teachers that were in the school? So, the sense that I'm the dean of discipline, does that decrease if there are more black male teachers in the school or less? Any of those kinds of reactions that you get there? Is that contingent on how many folks are in the building?
So I'm gonna I'll have to go back to my study, right? Because this was this is the PD. So having more black male teachers in the building allowed participants to feel like they could change their schools, right? So one example was participants who talked about, like one guy joined, he was the only guy, he joined the recruitment team, right? And he felt like in trying to join it, being the only black male teacher, right, that he could try to get more other black males or others of color to become teachers. And he felt like, and the only reason why he was asked to join it was because they needed to have a diverse body, but they didn't necessarily respect his opinion. So his desire to So his desire to join the organization, the committee did not necessarily help him really shape the organization. The guys where there were many more black male teachers, those schools also had more black teachers in general, and those teachers felt like they could, because there was a critical mass, that they were more able to shape their schools. And so in one school where there were many more black male teachers, these teachers talked about creating almost like an affinity group to talk about the issues of black students and how to sort of problem solve. So the number was really about helping them feel empowered to sort of change their schools. And if there were less of them, they were less likely to do that, or believe they were less likely to do that. Yes?
I was a TFA core member in Atlanta, Georgia, and we participated in something quite similar. But I was wondering if in your studies or in this, was there any relationship between the program and the principals of the, like were the principals aware that this programming was taking place? Yeah. And I'm just wondering like what that looks like.
Yeah. So for this, no. There were principals did not participate, and I think that I think that having the principals there at some points might be important, but I think that there were also times, because of the way that the teachers are evaluated, that having principals there can really move them away from having really intense conversations. So I think that at some points you want to bring the principal in, and I think at some points I think it could be, it might be harmful. But in this, there were no principals, there were just teachers. Yes, then I'll go this way.
I'll be quick. Does mentorship / sharing, like among peers, does it have to be structured in the education system, or is there not a culture where people feel obligated to reach out when they need help?
So is your question based on the premise like why wouldn't these guys, like why in their schools, everyday schools, why wouldn't they feel like the need to go and ask for support?
Not just in their schools, in their communities, but also have mentors within their career path that they can have some of this discussion with, since it seems to be non-existent. Is there a need for structure?
Yeah, I would say so, because just by dint of having very few, right, everyone is being asked to do, many of these men talked about having to do multiple jobs just because they were, the only black male teacher, right, in their school. So I think people are very scattered, and it's not like they don't want to help, folks who are in need, but, in the sort of the day-to-day work, you can't, there's very little time to pause and recognize that there might be other people around you. And plus, if you're the only black male teacher in your school, when do you have time to interact with someone else, right? I mean, teachers have very little time to interact with the person next door to them when they're teaching, much less someone in a different building. So I think having sort of very intentional structure is important and necessary. Yeah, Joe.
Nice job for the presentation and for the discussion. You did all this work in Boston, right? Most of it.
Yes, all of Boston.
Who here in New York, where the proportion of black and Latino teachers has decreased fairly steadily over the past 10 years, who's working on this particular issue here that you can recommend that's here on the ground that you may have access to?
So, about a month ago, I had a conversation with Competence, who is the policy director for the YMI initiative here in the city. And there's another guy who's working with him now, is working with Richard Bury, so he and I have had a conversation about creating some version of this kind of program here in the city. But those conversations are really in their nascent stages. But yeah, I think that clearly in Boston there are 56,000 students, right? And so it's a really small district. So it's a really, it's a great place to try out some stuff. New York is just to bring this to scale, I think, but it's not necessarily, I mean, it could be done. And I think that Competence is interested in doing this. So we had a very positive conversation. Oh, I was going to go here and then here. Yes.
Sure. So
I'm the sit.
I think for one of the slides that you slipped over had to do with cultural competence. And sort of my thing is that, at least listening to some of my peers, the only thing black about most of the schools are the students who attend. So there isn't very much around history or culture being discussed. With this affinity group and sort of the discussions that happen, are the teachers more influential in being able to bring that conversation to their administrators? How successful is that?
So again, this is not, so I should just really set this up. So this might have appeared, in many ways this program was very formal. Like we met every month, there was an agenda, but in terms of like data collection, at the same time that I was, to use Blanca's word, dissertating, right? Which is a real word, At the same time I was, collecting the data for my dissertation, and like, superficially analyzing it to create this, and then I created this program, right? And so I think that if I had been more intentional, I think I would have spent time looping back with teachers to see how their practice changed and how they took that learning back to the organization, right? So I think that's sort of one failing of this, is that while while these teachers felt supported, right, that if they're still returning to those same hostile places, then what change really happened? So I think that's a really important point. That my hope is that as people sort of bring this to scale, that people are really intentional about taking the learning that's happening with these teachers back to their schools. One of the things I did, because I was working at the Boston Teacher Residency Program, was that I did take the learning back to my colleagues. So, so I did share with my colleagues how some of the male educators of color, right, were experiencing and having some really negative experiences by dint of going through our program. And so that was my work, but in terms of taking it to the school, that I did not do. But I think it's a great point. It's a failing of the program. Yes?
So two-part question, One, for the black male teachers that you said were the only black male teachers in your building, was that out of all the teachers that were not black? And so what I mean by, were there black female teachers in the building, or were they just the only black and the only black male teacher in their building?
So they were the only black male teacher. There were black female teachers. Another thing that I found, which was true of Boston, right, was that if I looked at the number of black men in the building, I could tell the gender of the principal. So schools that had, and Privacy was the principal, Chuckles. So schools that did not have any black male teachers were more likely to have a white principal. So schools without any black male teachers, I think 55% of those schools that did not have a black male teacher on the faculty had a white principal. 33% or so had a black principal. Schools that had 3 or more black male teachers, 55% of them had a black principal, or it was really the reverse, about 30 some odd had a white principal. And so one of the things I talk about, and I'm working on something here in New York City to maybe think about this idea here, is this idea of racial bias in hiring, right? We know this happens with black, I forgot the woman who did the study on black men being less likely to get hired than a white man with a criminal record. I forget her name. But you guys...
Michelle Alexander?
No, not Michelle Alexander. Okay, but the study, right? And so, really thinking about racial bias in hiring. And so, clearly I only have 1 year of data because that was all that they gave me, and Superintendent Carol Johnson was there. Once she left, they stopped giving me data, but the 1 year of data that I had, right, I found that to be true, that in that year, 2012, schools that did not have any black teachers were more likely to have a white principal. And I suggest to the district, and I asked, and this is one of the things I suggested in my testimony, right, is this an example of racial bias in
So I just want to piggyback off of what you said, because it's like a partial comment and it's partial question. So in terms of the YMI work that you may be doing in this nascent stage, are you familiar with the ESI initiative that's in the 3rd year here in New York City, where they're doing this whole piece with 40 schools that are working with Black and Latino males as a part of the student cohort? Have any of them spoken to you about doing work with any of the teachers in those 40 schools that happen to be Black?
So it's my understanding that YMI was ESI. Are they the same thing?
So ESI is one program under the YMI. YMI is umbrella. So YMI is doing stuff with incarcerated students. They're doing stuff at the community level. And then they have this piece in the DOE with the 40 schools.
Okay. So I just spoke to Comedic, and I think he's just at the, So no, I have. Happy to. I live in California, but I'm happy to.
Is it possible, I just want to piggyback with your last comment, is it possible also that Black male teachers are drawn to schools, right? That's the flip side, right? That's another potential explanation.
Yeah.
Are drawn to schools that are led by Black teachers, or Black principals, or Black principals.
So there is some, that is a possible theory. Another thing that I was playing with that I found, and this requires much deeper analysis, was that the guys who were the loners, the schools where there were just one Black teacher, tended to be the higher performing schools in the district, right? And those guys, so while they might have come, so they had different types of pedigrees. So was it they were attracted by or attracted to? That I haven't teased out, but that to be the only Black male teacher, those guys typically were, went to sort of tier 1 schools, and were more able to code switch. It was very interesting as I looked at the transcription data. There were times where the transcriber said, I can't differentiate the two, right, between me and the other person speaking, and that tended to be the loners. And so, there I think there's a lot of messiness going on, but you're right. I think it could be the flip side, but my hunch is that it's probably more bias than people being attracted to, the more challenging schools. Yes.
I had a question about retention.
Yeah.
So for those loner teachers, what's the recommendation if they can't have an affinity group or some type of mentor that is a social vocation?
So back to my study, as it related to retention, what I found was that the loners were actually more likely to stay in their schools. So even though the loners had really challenging times, right, they felt isolated, they felt disconnected from the school, because they were working in better schools, right, they stayed. It's really, this is an age-old story about working conditions. The guys, so in my study I had 27 Black male teachers. When I looped back with them at the end of the year, or at the beginning of the following year, 7 left. I had 7 who were loners, 20 who were groupers, who were 3 or more. 7 teachers left. All of those 7 teachers who left, they were all groupers. They were all in the schools that had many more Black male teachers. And what they cited for their reason for leaving was really about the challenging working conditions at their school. They're working in the turnaround schools, the schools that have been reconstituted, or that were going on the list. And so these schools, they said, even though I have many more, even though clearly I feel connected to the other people in the school, right, it's just a really challenging place to work. And so as it relates to retention, right, the loners are going to stay because they're working in better schools. But can we improve their experiences while they navigate those schools, right? The recommendation might be then to form these kinds of affinity groups, if you will, to ease their experiences as they navigate those places. Yes?
Just have a quick follow-up question to that. With the loners and the groupers, was the racial makeup of the schools, were they the same?
Yeah, so what I was saying before was that loners, teachers who were loners, those schools tended to be higher performing schools, so they had more white students and they had more white faculty. And they were better schools, which, which makes sense given what we know about how schools work. Was that your question about makeup?
Yeah, well, I guess I didn't want to be something that because they were high performing that there weren't schools in that group that were also, high percentage of minority students.
loaner schools relative to grouper schools had higher percentages of white students and white teachers. I mean, you know, Boston, it's I think it's about like 90% students of color, but sort of a relative, right? The loaners to the groupers, loaner schools had more white teachers and students, and were higher performing. I will leave my email address, or here goes my email address. If there is some way that you think I could be of help to you and your work. I mean, I didn't get to talk about, I was talking to Aisha about this idea of funding, right? I think as a doc student here at TC, I was trying to get my email address. It's T. Bristol at Stanford. You know, I was fortunate and I think somewhat strategic about getting, I think I learned some things about how to write a proposal for funding. And so, you know, offline I'm happy to sort of talk to people about that. And I've been very, you know, strategic about sharing some of my work and have, you know, shared it through many different, you know, public blogs and stuff like that, which has gotten a good deal of attention. So I'm happy to also talk about that offline as well. But thank you for your questions. Please, you know, if I could be of help in any way, do let me know.